All right, welcome everybody to the next episode of the Digital Marketing Agency Builders podcast. I'm your host, Tyler Narducci, and I have with me today Harry Morton. Harry Morton is the UK-based founder and CEO of Lower Street, a podcast production agency specializing in creating shows for agencies, startups, and enterprise clients. As more agencies rush to get into audio, it's giving rise to lots of half-baked productions that nobody wants to actually listen to. And according to Harry, it's not enough to just sit for 30 minutes and talk if you want to stand out from the growing competition. Much more goes into building and running listen-worthy and ROI-positive podcasts. Harry rapidly grew his agency from $500K to $1 million in just 6 months, and his team of producers, audio engineers, and marketers have launched more than 50 podcasts and produced thousands of episodes. Their client roster includes the #1 UK business podcast, Secret Leaders, brands like Hewlett-Packard Enterprise and Stanford Graduate School of Business, as well as multiple hugely successful agency podcasts. Harry is also the happy father of 2, avid mountain biker, and the occasional music producer. Harry, I'm so excited to have you here on the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. What an intro. That was, that's a lot. So yeah, thanks a lot.
You have quite a background, which is why we definitely want to have you here on the show. I think it's going to be an awesome episode. Let's go ahead and just dive right in. First, of course, congratulations on your massive success with your agency, Lower Street. Can you share with us just a little bit about your journey, why you started your agency in the first place, and then how you ended up in the podcasting niche?
Yeah, sure. So I guess audio's always been a part of my background. I grew up, to start with a bit of a backstory. I grew up in this tiny town called Frome in Somerset, which is like a small market town. Not a lot goes on there. And in the mid 90s, I was like 12 years old, and we grew up with not a lot of money. We didn't have a lot of stuff. But my sister and I, the one thing we did used to do growing up together was make these little like radio plays on little cassette tapes on this tiny little kind of radio thing that we had. And we'd make dumb stuff. We'd make like ads for like for like chewing gum or toothpaste or something. And we'd do like interviews with movie stars and like all this kind of, cheesy stuff.
You were making ads, like fake ads as a kid.
Yeah, it was just funny to us to like make.
Oh my God. If that wasn't a sign you were supposed to be a marketer one day, I don't know what is.
Exactly right. So we did that. And I remember one time around, that's like 1997. I was 12 years old and I saw this ad in a newspaper on the coffee table in our living room for a compact computer, this huge gray, ugly box thing with like, a floppy drive and a CD-ROM, 16 megabytes of RAM. I was like blown away. This 12-year-old version of me was like, I've got to have this thing. And so I hatched a plan with my sister to kind of convince my mum that this was the thing that we had to buy by creating one of these ads that we used to make on our cassette tapes. We went up to this thing. We made this big kind of pitch for why she should buy us this thing. And we took it downstairs and plonked the cassette tape player in front of her and hit play and like nervously watched her as she kind of listened to this thing. And like, the end of the ad comes and you get that kind of hiss, that kind of like sound at the end of the cassette tape. And like, I was just sitting there ready for her to go, like, we can't afford it, and give us all these like questions and all this kind of stuff. But she was just like, cool, let's do it. And like, my mind was blown. I was like doing backflips and it was the coolest thing ever. But that was, I guess, like my first kind of successful piece of branded content. That was like, this is kind of, I've been doing this thing for a long time and it worked for me then. And that's exactly what we're doing today. So in our agency, we're telling stories for brands all the time, and really passionate about it. So yeah, I went from there to working in audio industry in general. And then it was about 5 years ago that I, after working in a bunch of kind of sales and marketing roles, actually, that I kind of wanted to combine those two things into starting my own company and kind of trying to ride this podcast wave that we seem to be on. It's been a really kind of exciting time in podcasting, and it's been a lot of fun being a part of it.
It's been awesome to see the podcasting thing rise up so strong. And I'm not, you would know this better than I would, but it seems like the podcasting thing, it really hasn't like died off. Like I kind of, when I saw it rising up so hot and fast, I was like, oh my gosh, this is cool. But like in my head, I kind of thought it was going to go the way of like NFTs did. Like, I don't know, like NFTs were like insane. Everyone's talking about NFTs, and now like barely no one's talking about NFTs. And like, everyone's like, how the hell did they sell that picture of a monkey for $4 million at one point? Like, I kind of thought that podcasting was going to be kind of similar to that. And like people, it was a cool, hot new thing, and then it was going to go away. But podcasts are still like super strong. They're everywhere. Like and people that are not in them are getting in them, and just realizing that this is the new normal. It wasn't a fad.
That's right. And I think that's part of the reason, sorry, is that it isn't new in many respects. Like podcasting as a kind of a way to deliver this kind of content is new, I guess. But like radio has been around forever, and radio is still like a huge part of millions of people's lives. It's still like, outperforms podcasting in terms of the number of people that it reaches on a daily basis.
Yeah.
So I guess like, talk radio is not anything new at all. It's just a way of kind of getting it into people's lives that's way more convenient, way more based around your exact interests and needs and niches that you're in and all that kind of stuff. So to me, it makes perfect sense. I think it's definitely not something that, it's a behavior. We want to listen to stuff. We want to hear stories. We want to educate ourselves. I don't think that's going to go anywhere. So the shape of may change.
We're like built for like wanting to hear a story. Like if you just look at TikTok, like some of the most viral TikToks ever, like from an account that has like no followers, and then all of a sudden the video gets like 1 million hits. It's because the person told like a really interesting story. I mean, and they even talk like, okay, story time. And then they go into like a 3-minute TikTok that goes mega viral, and it's from somebody that was nobody, before that story. And why? Just because they were effective storytellers. And there's a huge lesson there for brands and everybody, getting into the podcast. When you started Lower Street, was it originally started to help companies in audio, or did you do something different and then shift into that?
No, it was that from the very beginning. I think I'd come from kind of corporate sales before that. So I kind of understood the needs and wants of brands. And I'd worked in, when I was a kid, I was making adverts on cassette tapes for Christ's sake. But but then, in like my professional career, a lot of the stuff I was working on was ads and kind of traditional agency stuff. So I got the language and knew that was the area that I wanted to be in. And I think basically, brands have the budget to do really cool things. And I think if the right agencies can kind of help them to do that right, to use it well and make good stuff, then we can make stuff that's as good as anything else that's out there. Because I think that's a lot of times folks kind of, when they start as a brand making a podcast, they think that they're competing with other brands like them that making podcasts. But actually what you're competing for is like Joe Rogan or Mark Maron or whatever other podcasts you could be spending your time listening to. So really, we want to focus on making actually genuinely listenable content. And that's what gets me really excited. So I love working with brands because they have the budgets to allow us to kind of create some really cool stuff.
Right. Because like, I think another way to say what you said, or at least how I heard it, is people don't want to listen to a brand's podcast because it's the brand putting out the podcast. Like, oh, that sounds terrible. Actually, who wants to listen to a company's podcast?
In commercial, right?
Right. Like, who wants to listen to that? They want to hear what the story is that they're telling. Like, they want to hear the valuable content that they're producing. If they're producing garbage about their brand and their company and everything, no one wants to hear that, So it's more about going out there and giving them what they actually want to listen to, entertainment. Ultimately.
Exactly. That's it, ultimately what it is. And then you're just aligning your brand with that. You're building an audience, you own that audience, but you're not sort of shoving your brand's message down their throat. You're just kind of hanging out with these people in your community on a weekly basis or a daily basis or a bi-weekly basis, whatever that looks like.
Yeah.
That's the value.
That's so awesome. So you were able to grow your agency, your podcasting agency, like rapidly. So you were talking from 500K to 1 million, or doubling the top line revenue in just 6 months. What went into that in terms of being able to do that, and what should our listeners do if they also want to be able to scale their agencies quickly as like you did?
Yeah. So I think one of the main things was through podcasts, right? Like we eat our own dog food here, and we're passionate about podcasting, and that's one of the things that we have utilized. I think particularly when we're talking about agencies using podcasts, one of the ways that it works so fantastically is it's a phenomenal door opener. Like, you would be amazed by the seniority, the level of folks that you can have a conversation with if you invite them onto your podcast. It's much harder if you say, hey, can I send you my sales deck? Or, hey, can I like invite you to this event at some thing that's kind of hard to turn up to? But instead of you say, hey, just you stay in your office, you just jump on a call with me and we're going to make a podcast and you're going to speak to my audience of people that want to hear your opinion. That's a wonderful way to start a relationship with an account that you want to be working with. And so that's exactly what we did. We set up some podcasts in various different kind of niches to speak to the folks that we wanted to work with. And it was just a fabulous way to get known within that industry. So you kind of create almost like an echo chamber within that sort of space. But then also it just is a straightforward relationship starter. So almost for us when we're producing this, and for a lot of the agencies that we produce podcasts for, almost the audience is like the benefit. It's like the icing on the cake. Whereas actually just the process of making the show is like the immediate benefit. And so that was a big part of what we did to from a sales perspective to grow.
That is like insanely like a ninja tactic, because it's completely like, I don't know, it's the opposite of what you'd think you would need to do. And like the process of it is the actual leverage that you're getting, instead of, so you're able to approach. So let me just clear this up. You were reaching out to your ideal clients,
right?
Inviting them onto your show. Correct. To talk shop on an episode, and creating that environment where you can actually talk after the show about their actual audio needs. And you've approached them, you've built the rapport, crazier than anyone ever could on a quick call. Right. And you now have a great in with that company because they know you, they trust you, they like you because they jammed with you on a podcast episode.
An hour talking with you, which is much longer than you'd ever get someone on a sales call for. You've stroked their ego because you've said, hey, look, I respect your opinion and I want to share that with my audience. You've understood their problems and the things that they're working through and the challenges that they're facing by the questions that you ask on the show. And then naturally you kind of hit the stop button after the show's recorded and they say, hey, so tell me what you're working on. And they just ask those questions out of, normal human politeness. I think it's important to say here, like, this strategy only works if you have like a really robust sales system behind it. Like, you need those really strong follow-ups and all this kind of stuff. But it is just a wonderful kind of thing. And then, as I say, then the audience piece that you get at the back of it, because a lot of folks from brands that are starting podcasts to sort of market themselves, they're thinking about it as like, okay, I've got to grow this audience, and then I'm going to monetize the audience by selling, a percentage of them are going to reach out to us to work with us. And that does happen, but that's just a way longer sales cycle. It's much longer because firstly, it takes a while to grow a podcast audience. We really need to be publishing for 6 months plus before we start to see those numbers really kind of tick up, as I'm sure you could attest to with your experience here. And then when we've got that audience, folks aren't always ready to take action today. Like, who knows, they could be ready today, they could be ready in 12 months.
It's super slow burn.
Slow burn and basically really hard to measure because it's so slow. It's like hard to say like, hey, we're investing X dollars in podcasting. What's it delivering for us? So we wanted to figure out how to close that loop. And one of the things that we've done to address that is exactly that. The guests on the show, they are the value. And then everything that happens after the fact is icing on the cake.
That's so awesome. I think that is incredibly valuable for any agency listening to this. You're not, when you get into podcasting for your agency, the number one target is your guests, actually, that can become your clients. And then the secondary targets are the audience members listening to that. And I think there's also this giant feedback loop too, because as you put out more content, right, not only your audience, but also your guests are getting your new episodes. They're getting your content that you're putting out, that you're creating during the episodes. And so it continually creates more touch points down the line in your social channels when your new episodes come out.
100%. Yep. And by the way, we know that audience that we're building is going to be relevant to us, because if we're featuring our ideal fit clients as guests on the show, then the people that want to listen to that are like their competitors or their friends, colleagues, whatever. Like, we know it's going to be swimming in that same world. So we're sort of guaranteed to get the right listenership too.
So, okay. The only question I do have about this process is, what was the podcast about? What were the podcast episodes about with these ideal clients? What were you speaking about?
So one example is that we produced a podcast we serve a few law firms, and we wanted to work with more law firms. So we started a podcast called That One Case.
So you created podcasts for each niche that you wanted to work with.
Correct. And so, but that, that's just because, we're into it and we want to go super niche and make a bunch of these things. That's not the approach for everybody. Like, a lot of agencies will have a clearly defined niche, and that's what they got. So it's not like everyone has to make a bunch of different podcasts. But for us, yes, we wanted to say we work with law firms. We also work with other groups. But so this was one campaign for us that we wanted to focus on. So we just interviewed founders and partners of law firms in North America and just asked them to tell us. The focus of that show was very simple. It was called That One Case. It was just them telling stories of like some big wins in their careers or whatever, just to get them talking about kind of, their background and what they've learned and how that could educate other kind of folks trying to rise up to the position that they're in. So I mentioned ego stroke before. That's exactly what that was, right? People love.
Oh my God. And lawyers, they love to brag about their cases.
And so, we had no problem getting some really senior and successful lawyers to spend time with us because that was an easy sell, right? So it's
lawyers, they want to be on the bus, they want to be on the bench, they want to be on the radio, and they want to tell you about this massive settlement that they got. Like, they're some of the biggest, like the easiest people I think are niche to stroke their ego. So I think it's but ultimately,
really
like,
great talkers, by the way. So they make good podcast guests, which was a nice added bonus.
You said they're very what?
They're very good talkers. They're great communicators. It's kind of part of the gig. So so that meant that we made a half decent show too. So that was good.
I love it. So for those of you guys out there listening that are thinking about creating an agency or creating a podcast for your agency, just stick with your niche, stick with what reach out to your ideal clients, jam with them for 30 minutes to an hour about their marketing or their business and how they're growing it, and then put them in through your sales cycle afterward. It's an amazing tactic. I love to hear that. So I've always been a huge fan of utilizing podcasts for agency growth. What would be some of the main things that you would advise to an agency owner that wants to grow their podcast? How do they get more listeners?
For sure. Really, really common question. So I think we talked about how you want to use the guests as the driver for the kind of the ROI, basically, and that the audience is almost like icing on the cake. However, we still want to really, really think very carefully about the audience that we're seeking to serve. So we don't just want to put stuff out there just because it's great sales collateral. Like, we want to actually make a show that people are going to want to listen to. And so really understanding who our target listener is, understanding what shows they're already listening to, is a really great education on how we can grow our podcast. If we understand like the sort of neighborhood within which this podcast is going to live, the competitive landscape, we can firstly inform the way that we produce the show. So like, of the top performing shows, like, basic questions like how long are episodes? Like, are people engaging with shows that are like super long or super short or whatever? And also just so we can get some guidance on the kind of show that we should be producing, because any advice I can give you on growing a podcast is not going to matter a damn if you're not making a good podcast that people want to listen to. So that's so important to hit. So having that laser focus on who our listener is. But then once we build up that sort of competitive landscape, that also informs how we're going to market it as well, because we can then, the best way to market a podcast is to get in front of other podcast audiences where they're already listening to shows that are like yours, right? So, one of the ways that folks often think to grow their podcast audience is, well, we use Facebook ads, we use Instagram ads, we use LinkedIn ads, whatever, to grow these other channels. We're just going to pile a bunch of money into promoting our podcast. That's great for building awareness of the podcast. But what we found over the years is that it's incredibly difficult to make that leap from casually scrolling through your Instagram feed and like hitting the like button to then spending 30 to 40 minutes listening to a really in-depth piece of content on a podcast. So while it's very easy to spend a bunch of advertising dollars on Facebook, they're good at generating those clicks and getting our money. Actually, we found that you might get some listeners, but they drop off immediately afterwards because they're not engaged in the same way. So instead, what we want to do is put our podcast in front of folks that are already in that podcast mode. And so the first way of doing that is by being on other podcasts.
Wow. So guess you put yourself out there to, like you're doing on my show right now, speak on other podcasts, and I guess name drop your podcast while you're on it, or
exactly. So that's the first way, is like just be a guest on other shows that are relevant. And so again, I just want to come back to, we want to understand our audience, what shows they're already engaging with, and that will kind of inform the kinds of shows we should be pitching ourselves for. But so yeah, being a guest on one is one way. The second way is partnerships. So if you can find other closely aligned shows that have a similar kind of audience or subject matter, but they're kind of non-competitive, then cross promotions is a really great way to kind of build awareness. And that's almost like, you can think of it like an Instagram feed takeover or whatever, where you'll shout out their show, they'll shout out yours. because that endorsement from the host. So as a listener of a podcast, I have a real relationship with you, the host. And so I feel like I trust your opinion, your thoughts on things. And so when you say, hey, if you like this show, you're going to love this one over here, I'm much more likely to take action on that. So if you do that and partner with other podcasters, there can be a lot of benefit to that. And then I guess the third way is the pay-to-play version of that. So you can kind of just sponsor other podcasts. And that's what we do with our clients many times, is we'll find shows that are aligned with the content that we want to get in front of, and then sponsor it and have the host read out an endorsement for our show as part of a sponsorship kind of agreement.
So the second one, the partnership one,
yeah,
that is two podcast hosts that agree that they want the cross promotion. Neither one charges each other, and they shout out each other's show on their most recent episode, and maybe drop a link to it in the
link to it. Sometimes you even do like an episode drop. People do that frequently as well, where you'd literally play an episode of another podcast on your feed and say, hey, look, we just wanted to take this a bonus episode for today. We just thought that you'd love this. If you like this show, you'll love this one. Here's a sample of it, because then folks are actually getting a real taste of that episode. And
wow.
That really, really well. So for you in the agency world, there's like 1,000,001 agency podcasts.
Yeah.
And a lot of partners you could find out there that might be willing to do that.
Yeah. I'm already like going through, I'm like, oh my God, there's so many cross promo opportunities that I haven't even dipped into. One thing I do see as a podcast show owner is just an inundation of emails from different companies that want to promote their person. And so I never run dry on getting to choose who I want on my show, or because there's constantly opportunities out there. Yep. Are those typically from companies like yours, or they have a different model? And, is that the best way for a show owner to get on other shows, is to go through one of those companies? Or do you recommend that show just start guerrilla style messaging the owners? Like, what would you recommend if a podcast host wants to start getting on other shows using the step one you talked about?
So step one, being a guest on other podcasts, it's really, it depends how much time and how much budget you've got. So we don't actually do any of this guest booking ourselves. Okay. We work with a partner. We work with a company called Speak On Podcasts. Free shout out for them. They're really great.
I've gotten several guests from them. They are great. Yes.
There you go. So they're really good. But obviously it's not free, right? So you got to pay for that. But we can build these lists of shows that we want to be on and just reach out directly ourselves, guerrilla style, like you said. That totally works as well. But that's going to take more of your time. So it's just kind of
do you have more time, or do you have more budget? Right. And when you work with your clients, do you help them figure out like, okay, we're going to get you on this show, or we're going to do a cross promo here, or we're going to do an episode swap there? Like, is that all part of the strategy that you put together for your clients? Exactly.
Yeah. We'll plan out like the best shows to approach and the best ways to work with them. Typically what we're doing on behalf of the client is the sponsorship side of things. So, buying that exposure. But we work to sort of create a really kind of robust all around plan that covers all the different bases. Yeah. So, I mean, there are other channels as well beyond that. So we getting in front of other podcast audiences is one of those. But also there are ways to get in front of folks when they're in their podcasting apps too. So there are some apps that allow you to buy ads within them. But also the teams at Apple and Spotify and all of the apps, they have humans curating the content that makes it onto their home screen. So a lot of times people will hear mention of new and noteworthy. A lot of people like obsess over, I've got to be a new and noteworthy when my podcast launches, which is an increasingly hard tall order. But the way that that's created is by human beings who are listening to shows and deciding what makes the cut to kind of make it onto the homepage. And so kind of pitching your content to be featured there is another really kind of strong way to get some exposure. And but you can only do that if you have really great show, really great content. And so that step obviously comes first. That's the caveat to all of these strategies, is make good stuff. But yeah.
So one thing that I want to ask you, because it comes to my mind, because like I run a program called the Done For You Agency Program. We work with agency owners all the time, helping them to grow in many different ways. One of the things that I've had in my program since the very beginning was start your own agency podcast. There's a ton of benefit. And one of the things that I've always kind of thought and shared with my agency owners that I work with is like, you don't have to have like hundreds of thousands of listeners or even thousands of listeners on every single episode. If you put out a podcast, you have very few listeners, but those listeners are the people that have gone through your sales pipeline, and they're going back and they're hearing you speak as an authority figure in your market, then what you're doing is you're just like blowing out trust all of a sudden. And now you're this authority figure, and you're not just some person that was trying to sell them, on your high ticket closing call, right? Like that piece, that episode, that podcast episode is a really good authority builder to kind of drop in their email during the sales process, to just really get them to be like, okay, this guy knows what he's talking about. And I have confidence in him. So is that something that, you guys are constantly aware of? Like, are you more like, we want a bunch of followers driven, or is it more about like who's listening rather than how many?
Yeah, you? Absolutely the former. So like everybody wants more listeners, right? Like it's important from, you want to spread the net as wide as you can to sort of increase your chances of getting kind of leads and stuff out of it. But at the same time, we really want to focus on getting the right people. So like, one of the analogies I often give is like, if you ran like a small event in your local city and you got like 1,000 people that showed up to that were in your industry, like you'd be absolutely blown away by that as a result. Like that would be a huge win, right? Whereas folks will often look, I've only got 1,000 downloads on my podcast, like this sucks, like, or I've only got 200. And it's like, well, if you had 200 people in a room, that would be amazing. So I think we need to kind of, social media can often kind of inflate our expectations of what good is. And actually oftentimes 200 people that are the right people is like a massive win. So I would say that.
Huge. If you only have 200 people, but 5 of those people buy your $15,000 service, I mean, that's a massive win. I would much rather have 200 people and 5 people buy than 200,000 people with everyone just listening.
Exactly. And we have clients in the agency space that have closed millions of dollars in revenue off a handful of people that have done business with them as a result of the podcast, all quoting, hey, look, I listened to the show and this is one of the reasons I reached out. So to your point, as like this nurture piece, like, hey, we've contacted this account, the timing wasn't right. But like, but they listened to our show, and in 6 months' time, we've had them in our earbuds for 6 months. Like, who are they going to think of when they want to do business? Well, it's probably you. So this person that they know, like, and trust. So
for sure. And every time you drop a new episode, it gives you another reason to reach out and hit their inbox and reach out and be on their newsfeed. And like, there's so much that you can build from just starting with a simple podcast episode. And we'll get to that actually in a second. But I do want to ask you first, how often should a podcast, let's say you have a brand new agency owner, like, all right, I'm going to start my own podcast. I know first off, it can be really daunting to them because people who've never been into podcasting, they think, oh my God, podcasting, like it has to be like this big production and, I'm not ready for it. And like what I learned when I started this thing was that it really is, it's pretty straightforward. You don't have to overdo it with all like these crazy things. So first thing I want to ask you is, what software would you recommend, software and hardware would you recommend for someone who just wants to get started in podcasting?
Yeah, sure. So hardware, you need a microphone. Get yourself an ATR 2100 USB microphone, or if you're feeling flush, get a Shure NV7. They're a little bit more expensive. Like we're still talking a couple of $100, not breaking the bank too much, but those work really, really well. Headphones, always wear headphones. Don't use earbuds, as in AirPods. Next time, Tyler, get your headphones.
I'm learning as we go. That's why I had you here.
So that really helps. And the reason that helps, by the way, is it stops the if I'm speaking and it's coming through your speakers, it's going to get picked up by your microphone. It's like, it's not ideal from a sound perspective. So headphones is really great. And that leads me to the third thing, which is software. So right now we're speaking on Zoom, which is amazing. Everybody knows how to use it. You can't miss it. It never fails. However, because Zoom's tech is so clever that we'll never see drop off. Like we're always going to be connected and the line is always good. What that means is they're compressing this audio really hard. So it's like super low bandwidth audio. And what we really want for the best kind of sound experience is we want the maximum bandwidth. So there are tools that allow us to do that. Riverside.fm is a platform that I really recommend that allows you to record your video and audio in high fidelity. And so that you can use it for podcasting. So that I would strongly recommend that. It's like sort of $20 a month, I think, is their starter package on Riverside. And it just means the audio and video that you're capturing is of the best quality. So that always massively helps. So yeah, ATR 2100, USB microphone, a pair of headphones, and Riverside, and you'll be set.
Good to go. Love it. You know, my favorite thing about doing this show is when I bring these experts on that are like total experts in their field, and they make me better all along, just along with the audience, which is awesome. How often should a podcast show host be putting out episodes? Is there a magic number here, or?
There really isn't. I think agency owners, we're all like insanely busy, right? That's just like the life of an agency owner. We're always on meetings. There's a million and one things to do. So the thing that I always say is, firstly, consistency is so important in podcasting. What we want to do is build a habit in our listeners so they know, okay, every Tuesday, every Thursday, whatever the day it is, I know I'm going to get an episode of this from this person, and it just builds that habit into their routine. So consistency and delivering on that consistently is super important. So why that's relevant here is that basically we need to commit to a release schedule that we know we can commit to. So a lot of times folks will say, look, I can't do every week. It's too much. I'm going to do it every 2 weeks. And that's totally cool. If you say every 2 weeks is the thing and you commit to that and you do that week in, week out, or every other week in, every other week out, then you're good. Then that's a really good thing. It's much better to do that than to start weekly and then sort of like miss the every other week,
Yeah. Because so what you're saying is essentially you want to build predictability in when you're going to drop another episode so that the people who do like your show know when they can get more content.
Exactly. Now, the cutoff for how frequently to do it is a month. If you do anything less than every 2 weeks, and folks just will forget that the show exists, is what we found. So it's very hard to build that momentum and that following. So it's not worth doing unless you can do it every 2 weeks, in my view. However, the more frequently you can do it, if we're talking about this account-based marketing approach where we're inviting our best fit clients on as guests, well, then there's no upper limit to the amount of conversations we want to be having to facilitate that. So there's a balance to be struck. I think we want to focus on quality, not quantity. But if we can manage to do weekly, that's awesome. If we can manage to do two episodes a week,
2 weeks. Yeah.
That's really great too. So just whatever is realistic for you in the long term.
Love it. Okay. Is there a magic length of time an episode should be?
No. So one of the things that gets thrown around our industry a lot is this sort of this phrase that an episode should be as long as it needs to be and not a moment longer. And what we mean by that is like you want to give it enough time that you can cover all the things that need to be covered, but you just don't want to have all the extra waffle, the kind of fluff, the filler. So you want it to be as tight as you can to get all of the things across that you need to get across. There's no one right answer. Joe Rogan is the biggest podcaster in the world, and his episodes are insanely long.
Crazy
Dan
long.
Carlin, Hardcore History is like 4 hours marathon things, and they're wildly popular.
However, I would love to see Joe Rogan's stats though. Like, do people drop off after 1 hour with him, or are they really there the whole time?
Exactly. Well, only he can give us that answer.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's clearly working. Something's working for him. But I think for most podcasters, the answer is probably somewhere around the 30-minute mark. If we think about like how long is the average TV show that we're engaging with? Like what's the average attention span, basically?
Yeah.
I think that kind of somewhere between 20 and 40 minutes is the right thing. And whatever's right for each individual is for them to decide. But I would encourage everybody, no matter how long your episode is, to just edit more, take more out, because there's almost certainly in every conversation, there's some fluff. I know I waffle on like crazy, so I hope you're going to edit the hell out of me today. But there's just definitely, a lot of stuff that can be taken out. And so the shorter, the better, I guess, is one way of thinking about it.
Learning something new every day. I love it. So many people think podcasting is hard, just in general, and that's what prevents them from getting started on it. What are your thoughts on podcasting is hard?
Yeah, I think the consistency is hard, like we've talked about, like saying I'm going to do this show and then doing it every day, every week for 52 weeks straight, is in a year is hard work. So I think that's tricky. Generally speaking, the barriers to entry in podcasting are pretty low. It's much easier to start a podcast, comparatively speaking, than it is to create a really successful YouTube channel, for example, because there's just so much more to consider. Like we're shooting video here, but we're doing like talking heads style, right? It's like pretty easy. relatively speaking. We're not going to like studios and lights and all this kind of stuff. So I think podcasting has a much lower barrier to entry. Everyone has something to share. And so we can all jump on the mic and do that. I think the hard bit comes in when we're thinking about how do we actually make something that's truly differentiated and valuable to our audience and not just more noise. And then I think doing that on a consistent basis is kind of hard.
Yeah, that's I agree with all of that. I think, and in addition, I just want to add, like, just like anything, do it. Like, don't be scared to do it. Just jump in. The water's fine. You're gonna do fine. Right. It's not gonna be perfect when you start at all, but you're gonna learn. You're gonna grow, and you'll get there. What are and this, like I mentioned this earlier, that like one of the things I love podcasting for is how valuable the original content piece is, right? Like the hour that you talk on here, I think can go so much further to help your business than just this episode. So in your opinion, what are some ways that you can, an agency can repurpose a single podcast episode to further their own marketing efforts?
Yeah, for sure. So I think like the absolute basics are get a transcript done of each episode. That's great for your SEO. It's also great for accessibility to make sure that everyone can kind of consume the stuff that you're making. So transcripts are super important.
What do you do with those?
Literally having them up alongside the episodes on your website is just great. So that folks that need them can get them. And so that Google can crawl them. So that's always helpful. So that's the first one. And then of course, like the next obvious answer is social media. So creating snippets, audiograms as they're called, or just kind of like quote cards or whatever, like all of this sort of social content that comes from it. I think what we've seen is that like audiograms are the kind of popular way of promoting a podcast on social. We don't necessarily see the highest engagement with them though, because they're not sort of like social natives. So I think one of the things that we can do is think about using social platforms natively in the sense of like, we've just recorded this episode. Tyler, you might then jump on like, I don't know, Instagram live might be your thing or whatever, and just go, I just shot this amazing episode with this, and like shooting it on your phone, right? So you're like using it like right in the experience there, making native content. I think that's the point I'm trying to make. Talking to this, bozo from the UK. It's great. You're going to tune in next week when this thing goes live. Like those are really great, short and sweet opportunities to get in front of your audience and kind of make them aware of the stuff that you're doing. And I think that also podcasts are just really wonderful opportunities to repurpose other long form bits of written content. So, we're talking here about podcasting. You could go away and use this, or someone on your team could go away and use this to write a blog post about how to create an agency podcast or whatever, So it's pretty ripe material for sort of chopping up and using in all sorts of different ways. The final one I'll mention is that YouTube is a really growing space for discovery of podcasts. And we talked about Joe Rogan before. That's what got Joe Rogan famous, was this incredible strategy he had of not only putting up the whole episode so you could listen to that on YouTube, but also having those like 8 to 12 minute chunks where it's just like Elon Musk on marijuana, or Elon Musk on, the latest solar technology, I don't know, whatever the topics are, AI, those kinds of things. And those are really kind of like bite-sized chunks that are very easy to sample and find and discover, but they're also like really SEO rich. And of course, YouTube is the second biggest search engine out there. So that's a really great opportunity as well. So those are the main buckets I would think about.
Yeah. And like, it's like, I can't even overstate how huge those buckets are. Like they're the amount of possibilities that an agency owner, different ways that an agency owner can take content, whether it's snippets, written form from the transcript, blogs, one of the things I love to do is I love to take, less than 1 minute clips of, you speaking or me speaking, put it on Instagram, share it with, our internal Facebookers. And there's just so much. And it's an amazing place to start when you're looking for content. A lot of people, they do it backwards. I need to create a piece of content for Twitter, now a piece of content for Instagram. And they're running themselves dry because they're trying to create content for each channel. Instead, have a single podcast episode and you have content for everybody. Chop it up.
Yep. Totally agree.
All right. Last question here. It's something I ask every guest that comes on my show. What is the number one piece of advice you would give to someone that is just starting their agency?
Nobody knows what they're doing. I think we all suffer from some degree of imposter syndrome, but certainly for me, I came into this with no contacts in the industry and no idea really what I was doing, and I was figuring out as I went along. And I thought, well, everyone will find out I'm a fraud, and this will never work out. But actually, the longer I go along in this business, the more I realize nobody else knows what they're doing either, and we're all just trying to figure it out. So just back yourself and go for it.
That is phenomenal advice. I remember the day I realized that as like a young adult, like turning into a real adult and being like, oh my God, like growing up as a kid, I thought our parents and like our teachers and everybody, like they knew what they were talking about. And now I'm an adult and I'm like, they had no idea. They were guessing the whole time. So great advice. Harry, thanks again so much for being on this episode. I know if I learned a ton, I know the audience learned a heck of a lot as well. So this is a really valuable episode.